Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good evening, one and all. Come in, pull up a chair, sit down, make yourself comfortable, pour yourself a beer. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the IEA, for the latest in our series of In Conversation events. And in these conversations, I sit down with a politician, a businessman, a thought leader, a campaigner, an all-round newsmaker to discuss their life, their views, their philosophy, and what they make of the world around us at the moment. And we've got a superb guest with us this evening. But before I introduce him, let me just get the boring housekeeping out of the way. Some folk are watching us on the Zoom feed of this, others on the YouTube side. If you're on the Zoom side of the conversation and you would like to put a question to our guest, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Put your questions in there. Use the chat box or anything else if you want to share links, complain about me drinking too much beer or anything else. By all means, put that in the chat box. But the Q&A is where you should put your cues. And you can keep an eye on that as our audience. Even if you haven't asked a question yourself, you can vote up questions that you particularly want me to answer. And I'm a democratic kind of guy. I'll tend to pick those at the top of the list. And to give you an idea of topics, we're going to be covering a vast range of things tonight, from free trade post-Brexit, the latest vote in the House of Lords about genocide and free trade. We're going to be covering the State of the Union of the United Kingdom, regulation, freedom of speech. There's going to be a huge amount to go through, and indeed the present roadmap to freedom, the one-way route to freedom, as the Prime Minister called it just the other day. So if you've got burning questions on those, put them in the chat box as soon as they pop into your mind, and I'll try and sprinkle those into the conversation. That's the boring stuff out of the way. Now on to the excitement. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's fantastic guest, long-term friend of mine, dear friend of the IEA, Lord Daniel Hannan of Kingsclere. I think I pronounced that right. Daniel will be able to pronounce me. He will be able to correct my pronunciation. Dan is a politician, an author, a columnist, a journalist, a public intellectual. On the 1st of this month, he was introduced to the House of Lords. Congratulations, Dan. I think this is the first time I formally congratulated you. He serves on the UK Board of Trade as a vice chairman of the Conservative Party responsible for its international relations. Prior to this, he sat as a Conservative MEP for just over 20 years. He was a founder of Vote Leave, the official organisation that was successful in ensuring the outcome of the Brexit referendum to leave, but that rather underplays his role in it. Dan has been a lifelong Brexiteer, and I think you could say probably the man who's done more over many, many years to ensure that Britain is now on the outside of the European Union. As well as his work in politics, Dan's written a total of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. And he regularly writes for the Sunday Telegraph, the Washington Examiner, Conservative Home, many other outlets, you name it. And if that wasn't enough, he's the founding president for the Initiative for Free Trade, teaches at the University of Buckingham and at the University of Francisco Marroquin. Quite a CV. Dan, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A very good evening to you, Mark.
So let's actually get, there's a whole plethora of things I want to ask you about trade, Dan, but let's start with where you've just hot-footed it from, the House of Lords. There is a discussion going on, and you've just voted on whether, if the courts find that our putative trade partners have been involved in genocide or some other human rights abuses, the British courts could render null and void a free trade agreement signed by the British government. Have I understood that correctly?
That's a pretty good summary, yeah. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's a pretty accurate summary. And most of the argument in both houses of Parliament has been about, if you like, the politicization of the judiciary. Ministers have said, well, you know, this isn't really the right role for judges, and it's dragging them into the political arena. And if, as is fairly likely, the courts rule that they had insufficient evidence to make a determination, then it could be counterproductive, because the bad guys would say, look, we've been cleared by the British. All of that's perfectly valid, but I think it falls at a much earlier hurdle than that. Frankly, trade sanctions are a terrible tool of foreign policy. They hurt the wrong people. They clobber ordinary folk in your own country and in the other country. And they drive support for the regime. You actually end up, it's not just useless, it's counterproductive. You end up propping up the regime of which you disapprove. I, for example, have always been of the view, and I suspect that they knew it themselves, that the Cuban communists survived, a generation longer than the communists in most of the world, because of the US blockade. It allowed the Castro clique to tell Cubans that poverty was not caused by Marxist economics, it was caused by the Yankee embargo. And people, when they feel under siege, they rally to the regime. Putin knows it, right? The reason he keeps picking fights with us, the reason he keeps stimulating these conflicts is not because he's obsessed with absorbing some little sliver of Georgia or whatever. It's because constant quarrels with the West make his population anxious and patriotic and defensive, and therefore, if you like, exactly in the mood to back Putin. And so I really feel we're making a mistake with this by saying it's how many times have you seen this at the IEA? It's like the classic bogus sequence in politics that says something must be done. Oh, here's something, let's do that. And very quickly it becomes, I'm voting for this because I'm against genocide, without the case being proved at all. And I'm afraid that is a real danger in any democracy, that you get kind of performative legislation.
But let me just put, so essentially you're on the side of the government here. You and the government are at one on this, but the House of Lords has asked the government to think again, so that you and the Lords, despite your vote, have sent it back to the Commons. Where is this going to end? I mean, is this just the House of Lords signalling something,
there is
or is the government going to prevail?
There's a lot of support in both parties for this amendment. And by the way, when I say there is some performative outrage, I do not for a moment want to suggest that that is true of the authors of the legislation. The moving force here is Lord Alton, David Alton, the former Lib Dem, or Liberal, I think he was, MP, who, no one would accuse him of virtue signaling. He manages the quite difficult achievement in politics of being moral without being moralistic. And a lot of the people supporting it in all parties have been quite thoughtful about it, but not everyone. And certainly outside Parliament, you tend to get this kind of, don't you care about the Uyghurs or whatever, or the Burma or whatever. Well, really, can we not please raise the tone a little bit from there? Can we not take it as read? I don't think this is setting the bar too high, that all of us are against crimes against humanity. I mean, I really don't think that's that big an ask, right? Yep. The issue is, what is the most effective way to deter a regime that is engaged either in genocide or in some other appalling human rights abuses? Now, you could say, look, it is so awful. We have such an imperative, such a moral obligation here, that our only option is to stop the genocide or be defeated in the attempt. We will go in and patrol Xinjiang or Burma or whatever with a coalition if we can, and declare war if we need to stop it going on. Or at the other end, you could say, not much we can do. We'll just sort of make a complaint in the UN. The right question for policymakers is, where on the spectrum between those 2 points is the optimum? Where do you get the maximum impact in an affordable and achievable way? And I think the answer has to be with micro-targeted sanctions, where you go after the bad guys, the officials and the politicians who are responsible. And by go after, again, there's a spectrum there. Are you talking travel bans? Are you talking asset seizures? Are you talking arrest warrants? Are you talking in extremist sort of Eichmann-style judicial kidnappings? But as a general proposition, you've got to be better off with targeted sanctions, under which, by the way, I would include boycotting produce produced by slave labor. I would include not selling instruments of repression. But ultimately, you've got to go after the people responsible. You've got to do this as keyhole surgery rather than just sort of hacking around with a cleaver, because although the latter shows that you're doing something, it isn't very effective. And if you look at the history of trade sanctions, they've almost never worked.
So it looks like, all things equal, the government will prevail here, right? And it will be in the hands of policymakers, not judges, to make these judgments in future. And I was going to ask you about whether you thought, this a more targeted approach could work. You're not against sanctions per se. You're against like a blanket ban on buying Chinese rice or whatever. You'd prefer to target particular individuals or high-end transactions or whatever. But let's move on a little to the opportunities of trade rather than the sort of things that might be used to block Brexit, Britain trading with folk. So you've set up and run the initiative for free trade. What is your audit of where the UK presently sits on signing all of these trade deals? There's an impressive number. I think it's north of 60 now, but most of those in most parts are just rollovers of the arrangements we've had. And the sort of the fruit we really want to pluck from the free trade tree, well, a deal with the USA, a deal with India. Give us your prognosis over the months and years ahead. Good start or bad start? And what's the trajectory looking like?
It's an interesting question. Let me segue from the one to the other by saying that lying behind both the opposition to going further with some of these trade deals and the Genocide Amendment is a widespread but fundamentally flawed view of trade, a mercantilist view that sees commerce as a favor to be bestowed rather than as a growth strategy. We heard all this during the EU-UK trade talks. Why should they let us have access to their markets if we don't give them our fish or whatever? I mean, what? Because doing so is an act of kindness from them? Really? You think trade is an act of generosity? But that is an amazingly widespread view, and it lies behind this idea that you punish the Sudanese or the Chinese or the Israelis, as some want to do, by cutting off trade with them, which of course it doesn't work. But let me answer as honestly as I can. So we have 64 trade agreements in place, not counting the trade deal with the EU. It is perfectly true to say that a number of those largely replicate what we were doing as EU members, although they do go further in some small and important ways. Wherever possible, we have made tokens of intent. We've relaxed the quotas, we've lowered a few tariffs, you can get a few more Egyptian strawberries earlier in the season or whatever it is. And now it's fair to say that these are small changes. They are intended to, if you like, to flag up our intention to go further. Effectively, what we have said is, look, we've got limited resources here. We're coming to trade policy after 50 years of contracting it all out to the EU. We don't have any institutional memory. We don't have a practiced large international trade department. We're putting all this together from scratch. So we have to prioritize. We have to make some bandwidth decisions. And what we've broadly decided to do is to say, where we inherit a serviceable extant deal from the EU, we will largely leave that as it is for now, but with a clear intention to come back and liberalize further as soon as we have opportunity, while we concentrate on the parts of the world where the EU had no trade deal and therefore where we have no trade deal. Even so, we have taken the opportunity in some of those rollover deals to go further in important ways. So, for example, you look at the Japan deal. The EU had only just signed a trade deal with Japan, but when we went through it in detail, and the Institute for Free Trade did a paper on this, and the Trade Department then found the same thing. Actually, the EU-Japan deal was heavily determined by agrarian and industrial interests in continental Europe. It didn't really have very much to say about the things that we were really interested in as a modern services-based economy.
Yeah.
And so we had the opportunity to go much further with Japan in in services generally, financial services more particularly, investor protection mechanisms, data flows, and we did, right? So some of these rollover deals are actually—
And achieved it quite quickly, right? This isn't after 7 years of negotiation. This is after a few weeks or days. Yeah.
Very quickly. And that, by the way, that has led to a huge change of tone. So a lot of the sneering from the people who couldn't bear the thought of a successful Brexit, it's shifted from "you'll never do it, no country's ever done it, they all take 7 years" to "oh yeah, well, they're barely better than what we had before." They are nonetheless better. And the WTO says that our trade is now less restricted than it was. A larger percentage of our trade is covered by liberalizing measures than it was. We're now going ahead, as you say, we've got the US talks, we've got the Australia and New Zealand talks, which are now fairly advanced. I'm quite optimistic that we will have trade deals to announce certainly this year. I hope in the first half of this year. Obviously, things have been a bit slowed down by the restrictions on travel and so on. We are then talking to Mercosur, to the Gulf Cooperation Council about beginning ambitious, comprehensive talks with them. And the jewel in the crown, for once that metaphor seems apt, is India. We could be the first Western country to have an FTA with India. It's a fortuitous moment, both in terms of their liberalization and ours. And while all of this is happening, we are applying to join the Pacific Trade Nexus, the CPTPP as it's now called. All of this will mean that we are in a better place from a liberal perspective than we were as an EU member. However, you wouldn't be the IEA if you didn't hold out for more.
Yes, I'm not settling for that. Yeah,
exactly. We shouldn't settle for that. And I'm going to say this very frankly. The thing that has surprised me most has been the extent to which vested interests and protectionist lobbies have sprung into existence almost overnight. You know, like the fully formed hoplites that grew out of the dragon's teeth in the story of the Argonauts, right? And in particular, it's focused on demanding a more protectionist approach in agriculture than we ever had, even as EU members. That no foreign food should be allowed here unless it matches all, not just our food safety standards. That isn't in question, right? That's beyond the scope of a trade deal. You can't sell stuff here that wouldn't match our domestic standards. But this is all stuff that's being put on the table that no country does, saying, you know, in the production phase, we have to look at, you know, was the production phase green enough? Did it meet our animal welfare standards? Yeah. No country in the world has done that. And honestly, I didn't see that coming. And I don't think people did. You know, this country has done very well because it's, if you like, upscaled. We went in the 18th century from being an agrarian economy to being first an industrial and then a services-based one. We have been a net food importer since the mid-18th century. And yet we are now in a position where we are not going as far as we ought to go, even with Australia and New Zealand, you know, whose food products are counter-seasonal to our own, and on whom prior to the EEC we depended heavily for our imports. We're not even able to go back to the degree of liberalism that we had with those closest allies in as recently as the late 1960s, because people are putting these new barriers in the way. And I have to say, I'm really shocked by how many people who are fairly mainstream conservatives actually
who have become rural protectionists.
Agricultural
protectionists.
Protectionism, by the way, being a very loaded word, I would say agricultural destructionists, right? Because the worst, the most inefficient way to help our farmers is through tariffs, because the revenue of the tariff doesn't go to the farmer, it goes to the government. And the tariff is paid by the people who can least afford it, people on lowest incomes, right? So look, I am perfectly content to recognize the role of stewardship carried out by the people who look after our land surface area, right? I'm very, very happy to make a free market argument that says that since our landowners are prevented by state legislation from maximizing the value of their property by turning it all into housing estates or golf courses, because they are providing this incredible service to the rest of us of giving us these unique landscapes, this extraordinary beauty that makes the British countryside what it is, that it is perfectly reasonable that they should be compensated for that. But paying farmers on an acreage basis or for land quality or adjusted for what they do is so much more efficient as a way of targeting assistance to them than this ridiculous demand that DEFRA and the NFU are now making, that we should mess up all of our trade deals, that we shouldn't even be able to have the kind of trade deal that we would like with Australia and New Zealand, let alone more ambitious ones with the US. You know, it's not about the interests of farmers. It is just about, it's very striking in the House of Lords just now. Where is the opposition coming from? A, people who don't like trade, Greens and so on. Fair enough. I'm not arguing with them. Perfectly principled. They never wanted trade. They wanted to go back to a sort of pre-medieval barter economy. Fine. At least they're consistent. But much more culpable, people, including a lot of people on the conservative benches, who would normally get the argument for free trade, but who deep down can't stand the thought of Brexit succeeding, and who are now coming up with all manner of bogus arguments that they never used when we were in the single market. It would have never occurred to them to say, why are we taking, substandard pork from Denmark when it allows sow stalls? It never occurred to them to make that argument in the EU, and they now make it against every other country in the world, which I think actually is pretty outrageous.
But you mentioned your surprise and horror, Dan, at these protectionist groups rising up. I mean, I guess I've been surprised about the rapidity of it, how rapid it's been, but it stands to reason, doesn't it? Don't you and I, as free traders, have this enormous problem to overcome, as is so often true of so many free market propositions, that the pain is concentrated and the benefits are dispersed. So if you imagined, I don't know, free trade, unilateral free trade in agriculture, you might be able to say the average family shopping basket in the UK will cost, let's say, 25% less for sake of argument. But very few people get organised and protest on the streets or hire lobbyists in order to knock 25 quid off their Tesco's bill or whatever it would be. Yep. Whereas if you're a chicken farmer, got nothing against chicken farmers, the IEA was established by a chicken farmer. But if you're a chicken farmer, all sorts of reasons, keep out chlorinated chicken from the USA. Oh, it's not actually that it's bad for human health, but they treat their animals badly. This is going to be a permanent feature of the battle about free trade, isn't it? And in some ways, the dice are loaded against us because the benefits are so dispersed that nobody's willing to, very few people are willing to campaign for them, and the pain of competition is concentrated.
Yeah. Rem acute etigesti. You have put your finger on it. Exactly. I mean, I'm strongly in favor of chicken farmers. I was founded by a chicken farmer, as was the IEA. And I therefore know enough about chicken farming. One of the very few non-political things on which I can claim some genuine expertise. In fact, a distant cousin of mine, in fact, bought the chicken farm from the IEA founder in Sussex. I know that the issue of chlorinated chicken in practice is not really going to arise, right? There isn't any scenario where we're going to be buying a lot of chicken from the US, as opposed to what we do now, which is to buy it from Thailand and Brazil and so on. I mean, that's where if you like, the lower end of the market imports are coming from. But you are absolutely right. The four-word problem that all free traders run up against, dispersed gains, concentrated losses. Mm-hmm. And in the end, the only way you can win that argument is by doing it. And once you do it, it very quickly emerges that it succeeds, right? So all of these arguments were heard in New Zealand in the 1980s, before the agricultural liberalisation there. Kiwi farmers were briefly reduced to behaving like French farmers, blockading traffic and dumping things outside Parliament. And, it was going to be the end of New Zealand's economy and so on. Find me one New Zealand farmer now who wants to go back to the regime as it then was, protected, regulated, trammeled, confined by government rules. In fact, the liberalisation of agriculture in New Zealand, quite apart from marking a wider boom in the New Zealand economy, marked the most extraordinary boom for New Zealand agriculture, albeit in some different ways. For example, a lot of dairy farmers became wine growers, right? You and I are probably just about old enough to remember when New Zealand wine started being a thing at the beginning of the 90s. I remember my aunt from Auckland sent me a case of New Zealand wine when we were students together, when we were on opposite sides of the EU thing, although I hope still friends. And I remember drinking, it was for my 21st birthday. So what would that have been, 1992? Mm-hmm. And I remember trying some of this kind of, Marlborough Pinot Noir and thinking, bloody hell, if I had money to invest, this is where the future is. That was caused by the liberalisation. That was caused by people being allowed and encouraged to innovate. And I have every confidence in our farmers being as innovative, as inventive, as ready to embrace new technology.
As the Kiwis were.
Or as anyone else in the world.
Okay. I want to move on from trade in a minute, but just two very quick questions for you, Dan. I warned you at the outset I was going to ask you this. A great disappointment for me, and I don't want them to cook the books, but the official government numbers on the anticipated gains from trade are truly feeble. I think that the DIT's numbers suggest that a US free trade deal would add 0.07% to our GDP every year over a 15-year period, 0.07% for a UK-US free trade deal. What about Australia and New Zealand, albeit much smaller economies? The DIT number is that Australia would add 0.01% to GDP over the longer run, and New Zealand, get this, 0.00%. One of their projections was it might reduce British GDP by 0.01, another was it could gain by 0.01. If these numbers are right, why are we wasting our time talking about free trade? And if these numbers are wrong, and if they're wrong they would need to be wrong by a serious factor, a serious magnitude for us to really consider free trade to be something we want to focus our time on. Why are they so wrong?
If as the Spartans said to Philip of Macedon, I mean, those were Treasury studies, and immediately a red light should start flashing when you contrast the nugatory gains that we're supposed to get from everywhere else with the supposedly massive losses that we're going to get as a result of leaving the EU. We sell more to the rest of the world than we do to the EU. If you take total trade, it's still a slight majority to the rest of the world vis-a-vis the EU. So how can it possibly be that the EU half is so massive and affects, 7, 8, 10% of our GDP, whereas trade deals with everybody else put together is a rounding error? And the answer is, I'm afraid, that those Treasury forecasts were results-driven. They were tendentious. They were put together by people who fundamentally were committed to making an argument about staying in the EU or later staying close to the EU. So, for example, that US figure that you quoted, the methodology of that report was simply to say, here is what the EU-US trade deal, which ended up foundering on the rocks of EU protectionism, but here is what it would have delivered, and here is the UK share of that. Well, is that really the limit of our ambition? That we're not going to go, that we would have been as restricted and as unambitious as the EU, constrained as it was by agrarian and heavy industrial interests on the continent, was being in those talks when we don't have equivalent defensive sectors. I mean, do you know, maybe the way the DEFRA nexus is working, maybe we will be that unambitious, but there's no reason for us to be, right? We should be looking at proper, comprehensive trade that's based on the fundamental principle that if we can sell something in the US, it can legally be sold here and vice versa, and that this should apply to goods, services, professional qualifications, pharmaceuticals, financial services, the works. British Airlines should be allowed to do internal flights in the US. You should be, imagine how that would raise the quality of life in the US if you weren't dependent on the triopoly or whatever the word is of the airlines taking you on city-to-city flights. That kind of thing, which was just never looked at. It's considered to be beyond our reach, but it shouldn't be. We have huge opportunities, particularly in financial services there. The US obviously is wanting to sell across the range to us, including in cheap food. We've got to understand that buying cheaper and better food is not a favor to the Americans. It's a favor to ourselves, right? Which may happen incidentally to benefit the Americans, but that's not fundamentally why we're doing it. We're doing it because if people can buy more, better, cheaper stuff, then that gives them more disposable income that they can spend on everything else, which drives our whole economy, right? That it's a fundamental point, which is, however, one that I find, as you must do, find myself struggling to get across, even to some Conservative MPs who still think that, trade is about building up massive surpluses and so on. It's really not. It's about improving our quality of life.
That's a particular bugbear of mine, the concern about surpluses or deficits. And even, they'll remain nameless, one politician who said to me, what you've got to understand, Mark, is that they trade with us more than we trade with them. I was really trying to get my head around that one. Yeah.
I literally just heard that now on the benches in the Lords from somebody I was briefly an MEP with, Anne McIntosh, who's now a Conservative backbench peer. And she was saying, we've signed this terribly uneven trade deal with the Faroes. They're selling us more than we're selling them. And I was going, well, yeah, you know, who gets the better end of that deal? I mean, I just want to, for anyone watching who is thinking that can't be right, just think about it. First of all, Adam Smith's basic point, right? The sole purpose of production is consumption, right? Why do we produce anything if not to sell it? T-shirts, bottles of water, writing novel, whatever. You know, filling silos with it doesn't make you rich. It is only rich when you're selling it. So it's really important to understand this. Exports are the stuff we get rid of in order to buy the stuff we really want. And the more cheaply we can buy the stuff we really want, the better for everyone. And so the idea that, I mean, you know, if I think of in normal times, the pubs around me on the Hampshire-Berkshire borders, you know, the White Hart in Overton, the Bell and Dragon in Kingsclere, the Watership Down, I have a massive trade deficit with them. Right? They sell me way more than they buy from me. And you know what? Sometimes they engage in dumping. Sometimes they engage in the practice of selling stuff at below production cost. They might, for example, say, have a free glass of wine with this meal on such and such a day.
You're horrified when they do, no doubt.
right. Who gets the better end of that deal? So we've got to understand that as a country, the more we reduce our barriers and put money in our consumers' pockets, the richer we get. It is what lifted us above the run of nations in the first place. It made us the wealthiest place in the world in Victorian times. It was that. It wasn't, you know, colonial possessions or anything. It was simply that insight that we should stop putting unnecessary obstacles between businesses and their customers, even if the businesses were in another country.
So I want to segue from this and the ambition that you've stated there, and hoping that Britain has this trading ambition. I don't think I'm breaching any confidence by saying you and I were in a meeting the other day, and you referenced back to Boris Johnson's big Greenwich speech, in which he declared Britain will embrace free markets, decrease regulation, aim for lower taxes. He mentioned Ricardo, Adam Smith, numerous others, brought a glow to my bosom. This is wonderful stuff. I've been waiting for ages for the Prime Minister to say this. How's it going in practice there? And let me take a question from Keith Miles in the chat. He asks, Dan, do you think that post-Brexit reduction of excessive regulation is the most important issue? And so what should we be doing? And what's the government's actual outputs looking like in terms of policy compared to the rhetoric?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, hello, Keith, who was a former constituent of mine and is a mate. I agree with you. Look, I don't know if you were there.
I was, yeah.
I thought I saw you there. Yeah, I thought that was the best speech made by a mainstream politician on trade that I can remember. I mean, I maybe ever. I mean, it was both brilliant as a speech. It was Boris on
at his best
mid-season form, and we were going to be the Clark Kent that disappeared into the phone booth and came out to make the case and so on. And it was great in its content. It was incredibly ambitious, and you and I left with a spring in our step. It was almost exactly a year ago. It was February of last year. Cold grey day in Greenwich, and I was looking at the statue of Walter Raleigh and feeling terrifically optimistic and patriotic. Of course, 4 weeks later, the lockdowns,
the world changed,
and everything has been suspended since then. And I'm afraid that the experience of the epidemic has made it harder for people like you and me to win the argument for free trade, because epidemics flick switches in people's brains. They make us more introverted, more wary, more careful, more collectivist, and therefore more protectionist. I still think the ambition is there on trade, although we do have to resolve this internal contradiction. We've got to say that it will cost a 20th to compensate the people who think they're going to lose compared to putting tariffs up. We've got to stop allowing every minority sector to have a chokehold over doing the deals. But if we do that, I'm optimistic about the trade.
Okay.
On the wider issue that you and Keith mentioned about deregulation, I'm afraid I am less optimistic. And again, for the same reason. I think the epidemic and the consequent lockdowns have made people not just more acquiescent in, but more demanding of the smack of firm government, of dirigism. It's just like in a war or when there's a natural disaster, an earthquake or whatever, people become more intolerant of any kind of dissent. They want, I mean, we can see it in the opinion polls all the time. Every liberalization of the restrictions has been carried out in the teeth of public opposition. And I mean, when's the last time you heard a politician arguing that the grants that we're currently paying to charities and performers and so on should be taken away as soon as the lockdown ends, or that the bump in universal credit will have to stop, or that the free school meals shouldn't be permanently paid when there's no school, or that indeed the furlough should be wound up. We should be winding it up now and replacing it with a generous scheme of unemployment compensation, but we should begin the reallocation of jobs. How many people are being artificially kept in jobs that have already disappeared? Even in normal times without coronavirus, something like 15 to 20% of jobs are made redundant through technology every year. And that redistribution is not happening because it's a classic thing. We put the furlough scheme in place thinking that it might be for a couple of months. It was never designed to last for a year.
Sure.
But all of these government programs are much more easily decreed than reversed, and that, I'm afraid, is the problem we're going to have.
Okay, but what about the sort of stock of Brexit regulations we voted to leave to take back control? A key argument, it might not have been framed this way, was that the regulatory system of the European Union and Brussels wasn't fit for purpose here, all sorts of rules and regulations that weren't ideal to the UK economy. Let's talk about financial services. We spent a lot of time talking about agriculture as a proportion of the economy. Financial services matter an awful lot. Let's look at the MiFID directives and legislation that's come from Brussels. MiFID 1, that was introduced in 2007, forced companies to collect a staggering 24 pieces of data for every single transaction in regulated markets, multilateral and organised trading facilities. However, then MiFID 2 comes along in 2018, increases the number of data points by 270%. Regulation has got so bad that the IEA's own Philip Booth calculated that at the current rate, by 2070, this is about regulators, not regulations, on the current trajectories, by 2070, the number of people working in financial regulation will overtake the number of people working in financial services. Everyone will be able to have their personal regulator on their shoulder for their entire working life. Is any of this going to be reversed? I mean, I thought the stock of EU regulations and what we didn't like about them was one of the cornerstones of the reasons to vote to leave.
So it's a really good question. So you and I, and I'm sure most IEA subscribers, would agree about scrapping a lot of EU rules that were opposed at the time, right? We're opposed by the whole industry. We're not just opposed by libertarian ideologues, as it were. So a lot of MiFID 2, a lot of the Solvency 2 rules, the AIFMD, the short selling ban, there's a load of stuff that everyone was against until it was brought in. And then, of course, we know how this works. Once companies have assimilated the compliance costs, it's not just that they lose interest in repeal after that, it's that they don't see why the next guy should be able to come in without going through what they had to pay and be able to undercut them. So weirdly, they all then become advocates for the very regulations that they correctly argued would be burdensome and needless. And so there was always going to be that argument. And the role of the politician is to think about the companies that don't yet exist, as well as just about the existing players who, by definition, are going to be more comfortable with the status quo. And that argument was going on pre-Brexit. There were people who in the city who wanted to break free of the regulation. There were others who said, no, it's worth it to have the internal market. And it was not settled by the 2016 referendum. It carried on in the city and among politicians. To what extent should we trade off access to the EU for greater regulatory autonomy, right? You can't do both. Having paid a very high price to get the right to diverge, are we going to do it? Now, the EU, if you like, has settled that argument for us. It settled that argument for us in the most emphatic way by refusing, never mind passporting, by refusing to grant equivalence to our financial services firms. Now, equivalence basically is, it's a standard courtesy among developed countries. It's a way of saying that you recognize the validity of the other people's regulators. The EU grants equivalence to Brazil, to China, to Mexico in most fields of financial services. It is not doing so to the UK. It's not doing so for protectionist reasons, and partly peak because of Brexit. Fine. For all the reasons that we were talking about a second ago, Mark, that's the EU's cost much more than ours, right? If they want to deny their firms access to the world's best money markets, it's they who are going to end up paying the price. But a consequence of them having taken that decision is that it has ended the argument about the extent to which we should diverge at a cost of EU access, because we're not getting the access anyway. So we now have no option but to compete, to raise our eyes and to compete globally with New York, with Singapore. And that means scrapping burdensome and unnecessary regulations, scrapping things like the bonus cap so that you can actually pay people by performance instead of giving them big fat salaries if they're not making a profit, having a competitive tax system, having a competitive visa regime so that we can get the best talent from the world. We need to be doing all of those things. And we need to be serious. Having paid this price of exclusion from the EU, it would be crazy to get the worst of both worlds by getting the right to diverge and then not exercising it. So, and by the way, I think most of the city is there, other than one or two very big banks that are heavily invested in the current regulatory regime. Certainly most funds are there, smaller banks, startups and entrepreneurs are all there. Even our regulators are getting there. You know, the governor of the Bank of England has said in terms, look, we have to do this now. We don't have the option of staying in line with the EU. Whether our legislators are going to be prepared to make the requisite changes, that's the question. You know, because they again, are they going? They don't want to look as though they're kind of too pro-banker when the narrative is kind of rebalancing. But I mean, for heaven's sake, the financial services pay 11% of our taxes. You don't have to like individual bankers to appreciate
the revenues. Yeah,
right.
Now, I do want to move on to some domestic concerns shortly, but this ties into a question Barbara Freisel has put about the European Union we've just left, and I think it does tie into the divergence point, Dan. She says some of EU parliamentary members on the Conservative side, on the centre-right, seem to have perceived the UK as a natural ally for promoting conservative values and a liberal approach to how markets should function. With Brexit now done, that natural alliance has lost. Do you think there's a force in the EU Parliament which could fill this void to act for the purpose of promoting economic liberalism in the EU? I mean, I know myself, people who run similar think tanks to the IEA in other EU member states were in their narrow self-interest very annoyed that we'd left because they saw us as a free market liberal force around the table, and that's now been removed. What's your audit of that, Dan?
Yes, if I had been them, I would have been very anti-Brexit. I got this from the very small number of classical liberals in the European Parliament. Oh, it's going to be, dreadful without you because Brussels will be not just more protectionist and more dirigiste, but also, more anti-American and more kind of close to Putin and all this. To all of which I would say, guys, I can see that. And if I were in your position, I'd probably be saying what you're saying. But if you think about it, all of those from our point of view are extra reasons to get out. I mean, if the natural tendency of the EU without us is to be so much more protectionist and statist and socialist, then why on earth would we want to stay and subject ourselves to it? And I think to some extent this is happening. It's happened, as we've just seen, in EU protectionism in financial services, the rule on euro-denominated share trading and so on. I think it's also happening in foreign policy. A lot of Americans were, again, from their own point of view, perfectly reasonably anti-Brexit because they wanted an Atlanticist voice around the table. You guys should be in there preventing the EU from drifting away from the West and becoming cozier with the Chinese and the Russians and the other autocracies. It's happening, it's happening. You see it with the Nord Stream project. You saw it with the clownish visit of the EU's foreign minister to Moscow, sucking up to them and saying how wonderful the Sputnik 5 vaccine was on the day that Navalny was appearing in court. You've seen it with the China investment decision. All of these things are happening, and we need to recognize that they're happening. And just as the EU is now free without us to pursue a less Atlanticist and more Eurasian foreign policy, so we are now free to pursue, if you like, a more Anglo-spherist foreign policy with countries that are closest to us in terms of values and alignment.
Okay, I'm conscious of the clock and we've got a lot more to fit in, Dan, but maybe we could look at home then. Are we going to be in a good position to promote the sort of, kind of Anglo-Saxon classical liberalism, or is the Union of the United Kingdom now under great stress? We've got this Northern Ireland Protocol, which puts Northern Ireland in a slightly odd position vis-a-vis the rest of the United Kingdom. Max Giorgio on the YouTube side asks, what are your thoughts on the SNP's current push for independence? Do you think a second vote will happen in Scotland? What do you think the outcome would be? If you were to look at the UK post-Brexit, you might be witnessing another union that's going to come apart at the seams, right? I mean, Northern Ireland, Scotland, whatever. What's your take on that?
So just quickly on the Northern Ireland Protocol, it should never have been agreed. It rests on an outrageous proposition, which is that a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is a threat to the peace process, but a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is fine. Now, that cannot be true. That is a preposterous and shameful proposition. And the only reason that we agreed to it, frankly, is because you remember that after the Brexit vote, nobody in Brussels dared suggest anything as absurd as that Northern Ireland would be treated in a regulatory separate regime. That demand was only tabled after the 2017 general election, right? It was only when in Brussels they thought that they had seen a way to overturn Brexit altogether by making unacceptable demands. And it is, I thought it was disgraceful when Theresa May accepted the backstop. I know for a fact that Eurocrats couldn't believe their luck.
Is there any way out of it now, or have we just got to live with this and make the most
in
make
the
best
end,
of it?
you know, it depends. I would much rather modify it with the goodwill of our European neighbours. Certainly, I think there is goodwill in Ireland, right? This is now something that is working against the interests of both communities in Ireland. It's not just a sort of symbolic problem. It is creating actual economic barriers that affect both traditions. So it would be, you know, it should be a very, very easy thing if we're interested only in outcomes to say goods that are coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and are not intended for onward export, which is almost all of them, do not need to be subject to extra checks. So, you know, stuff that you ordered on Amazon or medicines going to the Northern Ireland NHS or stocks in retail outlets, you know, but if the EU carries on, if you like, trying to use this as a lever or as a sort of a way of signaling that there has to be a visible price for Brexit, then I think we have no option but to abrogate. But I want to come back to Max's question, which I think is
Scotland,
is a really big, a huge one, and because I've kind of changed my mind on this, and I suspect a lot of your listeners and viewers will disagree, but precisely because of my experience in the run-up to the EU renegotiation in 2016, I am conscious of what it's like when the shoe is on the other foot. So in that 2016 referendum, I was on the pro-change side. I was making a campaign against the status quo for a decentralization of power. This time I'm on the anti-change side, if you like, in that I'm pro-UK. And I can remember what I think was the EU's worst mistake, their greatest gift to us as leavers, which was their absolute refusal to make serious changes when David Cameron went into the renegotiation process at the end of 2015. Had he come back with any significant retrieval of power, just one big repatriation, one thing, you know, I mean, industrial policy, fisheries, regional, I don't know, one thing to show that it wasn't a ratchet, to show that power could go down as well as up, I don't think there's any question he'd have won the referendum. But what tipped the country to leave, I'm glad to say, was this sense that the EU was treating us with contempt, that even before we voted, they were not prepared to make any concession, they were disdainful. And so I am acutely conscious of the danger of unionists being seen to repeat that mistake. What they may think of as talking about more pressing issues at a time of COVID and Brexit and recessions and so on will easily come across as not listening, not being prepared to engage seriously with, at the very least, a large minority who are pro-change, maybe now a majority.
But why not then, Dan, go for a sort of federalist solution? You can get back to the origins of the United Kingdom and the active union. I mean, why not sort of say, look, there are some overarching measures that we should keep together. Let's not have 4 different embassies around the world.
Right.
And our nuclear deterrent, is, reliant really on us holding together. There'll be a few things like that: foreign affairs, the military, the monarchy. But your pensions policy, your education policy entirely, the tax rates you set, these are entirely matters for Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. If you want to, slash income tax, increase VAT, be my guest.
I think there is a very strong case for doing that. And it is compatible with a Westminster model, right? It works very well in Australia. It works very well in Canada. You get a degree of jurisdictional competition, which means downward pressure on taxes and regulations. Those countries are phenomenally successful states by any definition, right? We would gladly swap our problems for theirs at the moment. So I think there is a case for doing this. The problem with it, and I don't believe it's an insurmountable problem, but we need to recognize it and we need to be sensitive and judicious in how we approach it, is the imbalance of size, which is not a problem that they have in Australia or Canada. It's the
80% of the UK is England, you mean?
Right, right. So there wouldn't be much devolution to England. And who, would the Prime Minister then be the English Prime Minister, or do you know what? So now I think there are ways around that, and I'm particularly keen, as you know, on English localism. I honestly don't see any powers that could not be devolved to English counties and cities, right? I mean, Northern Ireland has a similar population size to Kent, more or less, right? If you can devolve to Northern Ireland, you can devolve to an English county. We should be ambitious about this. New Hampshire has about the same population as Old Hampshire, where I live. If you count, the city, the unitary authorities, they control their own police, their own welfare state, their own legal system, their own criminal justice system. I don't believe that the people of Old Hampshire are uniquely incapable of self-government. So I think there are ways of doing this. Now, how do we get from A to B? If we were a South American country, we would refound the state. We'd have a constitutional convention. We'd have a lot of Bolivarian noise, and we'd say, well, there's Constitution number 37 or whatever. But we're not fond as I am of my native South America, we're not a South American country. One of the things we've got going for us is great constitutional stability. So I would use that trusty, if rather staid and dowdy mechanism of a royal commission. And I would look not only at the location of power, question of possible federalism, different kinds of devolution, I'd look at a load of other constitutional anomalies and oddities that have now become quite difficult to justify. For example, the conduct of referendums, right? They've now become a fairly normal way of doing business, and yet we're in the extraordinary situation where you can change the franchise to get a particular outcome, as Alex Salmond did in the 2014 vote. Bizarre. We need to have we need to look, I think, at the powers of the Supreme Court. I think the Lady Hale judgment shocked a lot of people in terms of the extent to which that body was assuming political powers. We need to look at the composition of the House of Lords. It's becoming harder and harder to justify. I would like all of these things to be looked at in a measured, sensible, deliberative way that might then result in legislative changes. And while that process is happening, I think it would be truly extraordinary for either Northern Ireland or Scotland to wish to change its status until we knew what the outcome was going to be. And those demanding change would just sound weird. Now, whenever I say this, there is a certain kind of unionist who says, you will never appeal, you'll never appease the separatists. They hate the UK, is what they get out of bed every day. Yeah, well, duh, there needs no ghost, my lord, come from the grave to tell us this. It's not aimed at convincing Nicola Sturgeon. It's aimed at that massive Scottish opinion, a clear majority, if the polls are to be believed, who want neither the status quo nor independence, but something in between. And that is a pretty good reason in itself to try and deliver it.
Okay. Just on the House of Lords, very quickly, John Weldon asked, would Daniel agree with me that it's time for the House of Lords to become a democratic chamber rather than a house filled by retired politicians, which prime ministers want to reward? Daniel is, of course, one of the exceptions to this rule.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, having spent all my time as Billy No Mates in the European Parliament, because I was a Eurosceptic, I'm kind of conscious of now beginning in exactly the same way, despite the strong individual qualities of many peers on all benches. But I think the current system is impossible to justify, and I think it would be wise for peers themselves, who have always been the strongest opponents of reform, to go for some judicious reforms now, rather than waiting for certain abolition whenever we get a Labour government. Because I think we've now got to the point that the House of Lords cannot survive a change of government, and therefore, I'm enough of a Burkean conservative to say, look, being a conservative is a work of constant repair. It's a lease where an improving, repairing lease, right? So let's make sensible changes now, rather than have everything being razed to the ground by an incoming government fired up with passion, but which hasn't given it much thought.
We are on the clock, but there's a couple of other matters I'd like to get your thoughts on, Dan. One is about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. These sort of debates and discussions require freedom of speech. I think a free market requires freedom of speech. There's been a lot of concern recently about cancel culture, and particularly free speech on university campuses, people being barred. I mean, very mainstream people, Amber Rudd, Germaine Greer, I think Peter Tatchell was barred from speaking at something. And Gavin Williamson is bringing in this sort of free speech champion idea that will sit on the Office for Students board. What do you make of the state of freedom of expression in the United Kingdom at the moment? And is this the sledgehammer to crack the nut, or is this a bit of a distraction?
Peter Tatchell is a very brave man, but he would, I think, be horrified to hear himself described as mainstream, as you just did. But look, I mean, there is a real problem here. I'm a great believer in freedom of association as well as freedom of speech. So I'm not a believer in having government-mandated free speech czars and so on. Universities can invite or disinvite whom they like, but there is a real cultural problem here, and it is terrifying. Modern civilization, the Enlightenment, is based fundamentally on the idea that we learn, right? It's based on empiricism, on experimentation, on the scientific method, on the idea that we don't know everything, and that someone we don't like might still be right about something. That's how we get from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge. And that is the defining characteristic of Western civilization in particular, and the modern world more widely, right? It is, however, not something that comes naturally to people. We are, in our genes, in our nature, tribal collectivists. We evolved in kin groups, and the heuristic that we naturally want to apply is not, does what Mark has just said make sense? It's, do I like him? Is he in my tribe or not, right? The idea that someone we don't like might still have something useful to say is a very difficult idea, as we see on social media. It's an idea that has to be taught, has to be inculcated. We have to be acculturated. And that is the job of our schools, and particularly our universities. They were there to be the temples of the Enlightenment that would disseminate this counterintuitive but important idea. And what is terrifying to me at the moment is not just that they've stopped doing that, or a lot of them have stopped doing it, and this is becoming particularly a problem in secondary education. It's no longer just on campus. It's that they are doing the opposite. They are teaching the pre-Enlightenment tribalism. They are saying the only important thing about you really is whether you're black or white or female or gay or whatever, where you stand in this imagined pyramid of hierarchy and oppression. Not what you're saying, not whether it has merit, but whether you have privilege. You know, in other words, we have reverted to this pre-modern idea that our relationships with each other should be intermediated by birth or caste or tradition or whatever, rather than that we're all autonomous individuals. And I think this is the single most dangerous tendency in the world at the moment. And we miss the gravity of the challenge when we say, oh, it's political correctness gone mad, harumph, woke me up when it's all over. It's much more serious than that, because modernity is based on something quite fragile, something that has to be taught. You know, Hannah Arendt, the woman who covered the Eichmann trial, she had this lovely phrase where she said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And what she means by that is, you know, you and I came into the world with the same basic outlook, the same basic genetic makeup that our ancestors 5,000 or 10,000 years ago would have had, right? The reason that our world is not like theirs is because of things that we are taught in the family, in schools, in society. Difficult, counterintuitive ideas about tolerance, about listening to other people and so on. And if we stop teaching those things, see how quickly this whole construct of modern civilization reverts to the mean.
And do you think, though, Dan, that this is a kind of legalistic matter, that, you know, under this protocol, you must not ban people like Amber Rudd from speaking at the Oxford Union? Or do you think it's a cultural matter? Jamie Wells asks, the BBC is an example of intolerance, especially towards liberal thinking. Kwasi Kwarteng, the now business secretary, being roasted on Radio 4 by Nick Robinson for writing extreme free market books. This is Britannia Unchained that he worked with some of the IEA people about. I mean, you know, if you like, formulaically, in process terms, Nick Robinson can ask that question. But there's this danger to badge everybody. And I mean, I don't think it was a sufficiently extreme free market book myself. I think it should have gone a lot further. But there's a danger, isn't there, that culturally, it's no rule of law. There's not a sort of protocol we need, that we're badging that guy's a fascist, that guy's a communist, you're a racist, you're a homophobe, rather than engaging ideas. This seems to me a cultural poison rather than something that can easily be solved by an act of parliament clarifying protocols of engagement.
No, I agree with that. You know, as Andrew Breitbart famously said, politics is downstream of culture. And our culture in the UK has been exposed over the last 12 months to be a lot more authoritarian, a lot more illiberal than I had previously feared. I mean, I always disliked, even pre-coronavirus, how quickly people slid from I don't like X to X should be banned. You know, fill in your own X. It could be shooting pistols or smoking weed or expressing hateful opinions or hunting foxes. But the difference between I disapprove of this and this should be banned, that is what contains the entirety of a free society. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty of getting that across is depressing. The people's indifference to process when they happen to favor a particular outcome is depressing. But it has become much, much worse as a consequence of the lockdowns and the accompanying authoritarian mood. You know, for very obvious psychological reasons. And I think it's going to outline even, you know, if the vaccines work better than anyone expects and the disease kind of mutates into a mild form, we're still going to be left for decades, like after 1945, with oppressive statist policies that are not just accepted but are demanded by the population. I'm afraid we're going to be in for a very, very tough few years or decades as classical liberals.
Well, I just wanted to end on that exit from lockdown. There's a financial element to it. Robin Edwards has asked in the chat about the best way to deal with the deficit and the huge amount of spending. Will taxes have to go up, he asks. But what do you make of the government's, the Prime Minister's one-way street, the irreversible road to freedom? I mean, I'm looking forward to getting my freedoms back, but it seems to me somewhat ponderous, really, that if bad news comes in, he's going to dab the brakes. But if very good news comes in, the death rate falls to close to zero, he's not going to dab the accelerator. So June the 21st is the earliest we will get our freedom back.
Yeah.
He says he's data driven, but I mean, data could suggest that we could accelerate that in the coming days and weeks.
Exactly. Data, not dates, must work both ways. And it would be quite wrong if, as is, by the way, currently apparently happening, the fall in infections, fatalities, and case rates continues to tumble. It would be quite wrong to delay the process needlessly. It would be extraordinary if this country, which is far ahead of the rest of Europe in its vaccination, ends up, as we currently are, with more severe restrictions than the countries that are not vaccinating. I think that's a question of practical politics, that you have to be prepared to be flexible both ways round. I also think, though, there is an issue of principle here. We mustn't reverse the burden of proof. This awful idea has come around because people are now anchored from starting with the lockdown. This awful idea has come around that, it's for people who want to end the lockdown to show that you can do that. But that, of course, is absurd. When there are unprecedented restrictions on our freedom, the onus is on the people who want those restrictions to prove their case. It's not on the people who wanted the status quo ante. And, freedom, when you talk about the road to freedom, freedom is our birthright. Right? Freedom is not a prize to be bestowed or earned through good behavior as though we were prisoners applying for parole, right? Freedom should be the status quo. You need an extremely good, compelling reason to suspend it. And that needs to be not just rooted in data, but needs to be shown to be beyond probability, to be a clear price that we would otherwise pay. And that has to be the principle as we come out. And I very much hope that we can do it before June. It would be bizarre when we have vaccinated, as we will have done by the end of next month, the people who account for getting on for 99% of the fatalities. It would be utterly bizarre if we had higher restrictions than we had during the first lockdown.
Dan, on that note, we've overridden our time. Thank you for all of the amazing work you do on trying to make sure that freedom remains the status quo in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for your time this evening. We've covered so many different bases. Much done by classical liberals in recent weeks, months and years, but much left to do. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. Thanks very much indeed, Dan.
Always a pleasure to see you, mate. And thank you to the IEA. Thank you for everything you do. And anyone who is watching and who supports the IEA, who snubs you, thank you for doing that, all of you.
Well, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, not just to Dan, but to all of our donors who make all of our work possible. We're very grateful to all of you. If you'd like to become a donor, please go to our website and click on the donate page. All gifts, however large or small, are very welcome. Obviously, the larger ones are, they're proportionately welcome. The larger, the better. But please do share some pennies with us if you've got any. The IEA's online content will continue. I'm back at 6 o'clock tomorrow with this week's episode of Live with Littlewood, where we'll be dissecting the exit from lockdown. I'm joined by Isabel Oakeshott and Dan Hodges, amongst others. So please join me at 6 p.m. Tomorrow on the IEA London YouTube channel for that. On March the 9th, I'll be joined in conversation with Charles Moore, Lord Moore, Margaret Thatcher's biographer, and also a reminder to check out on our IEA London YouTube channel our new series on economic history with Dr. Steve Davies, perfect for students, parents, and even the most engaged policy wonk might learn a thing or two. And my thanks to the Monnery Trust for supporting those efforts. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the evening as much as I have. My thanks again to Dan. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Over and out.